Great. Well, thanks, Jake. It's really great to be here. I want to thank Slate, the New America Foundation, and Arizona State University for sponsoring today's conversation on internet freedom, which I believe is one of the game-changing human rights issues of our time. I also want to thank Andres Martinez for inviting me here. We've known each other a long time in lots of different capacities, and it's great to be reconnected. I get a lot of invitations to speak these days, but most of them are a lot less cool than this one. Usually the cool invitations go to my colleague Ian Schuler, who's our resident techie in the Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor. Ian's going to be speaking later this afternoon on a panel with Sasha Minrath about the Internet in a Suitcase program that we're doing funding, and that's being done here at New America. I want to thank also Steve Cole for his leadership in that effort. I'm particularly pleased to be here today because as I look around this room, there are so many leaders, policymakers, journalists, techies, activists. I see Rebecca McKinnon in the second row, who's been such a leading voice on these issues for so many years and a great colleague. All of you have helped shape this conversation, and many have helped governments, including our own, come to grips with the challenges and the opportunities that are posed by this transformational set of new technologies. We're excited about the Internet in a Suitcase project, one of a number of cutting-edge technologies and projects we're investing in. It's part of what Secretary Clinton calls a venture capitalist approach to addressing the wide range of challenges that democracy and human rights activists face in internet repressive environments around the world. By the end of this year, my Bureau will have led the efforts within the U.S. government to award $70 million in grants. We're supporting a dozen different circumvention technologies. We're supporting a panic button app for mobile phones, a slingshot program to identify censored content that users searching for in a particular country and then flinging it back over the firewalls where ordinary citizens can get access to it. Training programs to help activists operating in repressive areas to keep operating, thwart surveillance, and protect their privacy. To date, we've trained 5,000 activists in all regions of the world. In short, we're finding a whole slew of new tools and techniques that empower users to gain access to information, organize them, tell their own stories, and to stay safe online. But this is not just about technology. Secretary Clinton has put internet freedom on the map as a diplomatic priority. In our bilateral relationships and in our multilateral relationships, including at the UN Human Rights Council, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which just had a ministerial meeting, and in a range of other places. Many of you here today have urged us not to view internet freedom in isolation, but to wrestle with it with the challenge of integrating internet freedom with national security, combating cyber crime, protecting intellectual property, and other vital interests. And this is what we've done in President Obama's International Strategy on Cyberspace, which incorporates all of these interests. This is the hard part. It's where Americans disagree not only with repressive governments, but among ourselves. But we agree on the importance of getting it right. By now, every government understands the power of ordinary citizens to harness the internet and social media to organize and express their views. Some have embraced these new technologies as a way to connect and to serve their citizens. Others are redoubling their efforts to control them. We are seeing the development of a more sophisticated set of tools for cyber repression, including filtering, surveillance, anti-circumvention, and network disabling technologies by government security forces in closed societies. We're also witnessing the rise of cyber attacks, of computers, of independent media, distributed denial of service attacks on sites of watchdog groups, and other attempts to thwart the work of civil society. Before I joined this administration, as Jake said, I spent 30 years working on human rights issues from the low-tech NGO side. So now I want to refocus attention not on technologies to fight internet repression, but on the psychology of the repressors. What causes a regime to perceive the internet as such a profound threat that it is willing to damage its country's economy by choking bandwidth, blocking content, or even shutting down the network entirely? These are the acts of governments that fear their own people. In cracking down on the internet, they expose their own lack of legitimacy. But these crackdowns also indicate a basic lack of understanding that free speech, whether it's supportive speech or subversive speech, is harder than ever to suppress in the digital age. And the young people who have taken to the streets across the Arab world this year understand it isn't pornography or pirating that is being suppressed. It's people. It's their demands for dignity, and its say in the political and economic future of their countries. After all, Facebook does not foment dissent. People do. Twitter only amplifies those voices that have the most resonance, those ideas that people find most powerful. As President Obama said in his speech in Cairo in June of 2009, 19 months before the protests in Tahrir Square, suppressing ideas never succeeds in making them go away. 2 billion people today have access to the internet. That's a lot of speech to try to suppress. But in the next 20 years, nearly 5 billion more people will come online. 5 billion. Will they be joining a true global conversation over a single unified global network? Or will they be entering a stilted alternative reality of government-approved content on controlled national intranets? This is the vision of the halal internet being advocated by some in Iran, a course that would only deepen that country's isolation and the Iranian government's estrangement from their own citizens. So let's be honest. Governments that respect the rights of their citizens have no reason to fear a free internet. The internet didn't topple the governments of Tunisia or Egypt. The people did. By smart governments are using social media tools to better communicate with and understand their own people and to deliver services in a more open and accountable fashion. And they are recognizing that free access to tech tools spurs both economic and social progress. If you really want to address popular discontent, you don't need an army of censors deleting posts on social media sites. You need a cadre of government officials reading those posts and figuring out how to identify and address the legitimate grievances that are being expressed there. So don't shoot the instant messenger. Instead, address the underlying grievances. The corruption, the abuse of power, the environmental degradation, the lack of political and economic opportunity, the daily affronts to dignity by indifferent authorities. More than anything else, it is this quest for dignity that has prompted so many young people to walk away from their keyboards and into the streets to demand a chance to build a better future. And it's their vision of the future that really matters. This administration is working to support them. Our work on internet freedom is not about messaging, it's about empowerment. It's up to the people of each country to build societies in which government respect not some rights part of the time, but all rights of the governed every day. The role of the international community is to offer support, technological and institutional. Your generation, the digital natives, has developed new tools with unprecedented potential to empower people around the world to participate in a truly democratic process. The world is eager to see what you will invent next. But we are equally eager for your help in forging international consensus and setting the expectations needed to support internet freedom. It will be up to your generation to make this vision a reality for the 5 billion users by setting the rules of the road for the internet for the 21st century. The human challenge of the internet and internet freedom is to use technological tools to build a different kind of relationship between citizens, civil society, and their governments. A relationship based not merely upon the content of the governed, the consent of the governed, but also broad participation in governance by all citizens. With your help, we'll continue to put U.S. diplomatic power behind this vision and a more inclusive, peaceful, and democratic world. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for those remarks. And just to pick up first on what might be the newsiest part of what you said, we've seen in recent weeks a kind of ratcheting up of the rhetoric from the Obama administration about the crackdown in Syria in particular, and about the legitimacy of that regime. Are you going a little farther than we've heard previously in criticism of the Syrian regime's crackdown?
Well, yesterday I testified in Congress to the Lantos Commission on Syria. My comments very much today reflect what the President said yesterday, what the Secretary of State said the day before. We are increasingly aware that the people of Syria are under the gun, are being attacked for peacefully demonstrating, for organizing, for speaking out about things that have long been human rights violations in that country. And we are committed to reinforcing their voices. This is not about us. It's about the Syrian people. But as we've seen, particularly in the last 6 or 8 weeks, the Syrian people have lost their fear, and they are demanding accountability and openness and a free democratic space which hasn't existed. And we want to be standing behind them.
So maybe talk about Syria a little bit in relation to what happened to Egypt. If you watch this closely and you watch it from the perspective of rooting for the opposition, as I will certainly acknowledge that I have been, you have to ask yourself the question, why did this work in such a dramatic way in Egypt and bring down the government? And why is it so far not worked in Syria, despite, as you say, the courage of these Syrian opposition leaders who are obviously, in some sense, playing for their lives?
You know, as we look around the Middle East region, North African region, the one thing that's more and more obvious is that you have to take each of these countries on their own terms, given their own history and given where they are. There was simply much greater space in Egypt, many more civil society activists, and a greater opportunity for them to come together, and a government that frankly allowed them to demonstrate peacefully. All of those things contributed, but there was a much greater, I would say, opportunity, both in Tunisia but especially in Egypt, for the kinds of protests to succeed. Syria has been a harshly ruled country for many, many years, with a government that doesn't really know boundaries and has used violence in dramatic ways. People were demonstrating in Hama the last 6 weeks. President Assad's father killed at least 10,000 people there in 1982. So the fear factor was greater, and the fact that people have lost their fear and said, whatever happens, we're going to stand in the street, we're not going to be violent, we're going to demonstrate, and if they're going to shoot, they're going to shoot. That's where we are today.
So 3 big factors, and maybe give me a little bit of a sense of how you rate their importance. One is the simple connectedness of a society. In Libya, it's not that connected, which makes things very difficult. Another, arguably the most important, is the underlying strength of civil society that existed before the internet and beyond the internet. And a third, as you were referring to, is how repressive or aggressive or authoritarian the regime has been or is willing to be. Clearly a big factor in Iran. Are those the most decisive factors in the sort of the question of whether this sort of technology-aided opposition can succeed?
Yeah, I think those are the biggest factors. And what's interesting is that even in some of the more closed societies, the Syrians have tried in all sorts of ways to limit connectivity and people being able to communicate. They are communicating, and they're communicating across the country, so you don't just have demonstrations in one town or one region. It's the combination, I would say, of the internet, new technologies, and television. People are seeing images, and they're seeing images of what's happening in the region, and they're also seeing images of what's happening at home. I think those things are driving the discussion. But again, the technology alone isn't enough. People have to be themselves ready to take to the streets or to organize. And civil society organizations in Syria are evolving, but they're coming out of a very tough environment.
How does the Obama administration and how does Secretary Clinton and how do you see the proper role of the United States government in aiding these movements or not? You know, there's been money appropriated to help opposition leaders, opposition figures get around restrictions, firewalls, and so on. But you know, any help we give always comes with the potential stigma that the United States is involved in what would otherwise be an indigenous and local movement. How do you balance those things?
You know, we start from the premise that change occurs most effectively within a society. We can't force it from outside, but we can be helpful in both amplifying the voices of domestic activists who are trying to raise these issues. We can provide some measure of protection to them, and we can help create an international environment where these issues are discussed in a more intelligent way. We try to do all of those things, but we are very mindful of the importance of reinforcing the domestic voices. This is not about us, it's about them. And it's about governments that are refusing to allow their own people to stand up and speak for what they want. They want economic opportunity, they want a job, they want a say in their political future, and they want to be treated with dignity. Those are the basic components, whether you're in Syria or in Egypt or in Libya. And so what our job is, as we see it, is to make sure we stand for international standards of human rights, and we start with the premise that people need to be able to speak their mind and participate in the process.
Yeah. Michael, you know, I think I remember when I was in high school, you coming back to speak, as I said, as a distinguished alumnus and talking about human rights, and I remember it being one of the things that got me excited, really, as a kid about the issue. But as someone who's spent your whole career working on these issues, does the internet really change anything? I mean, are these simply the same liberal principles applied around some new technology and some new techniques, or are things really different in some fundamental way?
You know, I think the answer is it changes a lot. I said in the remarks it's a game changer, but it's essentially taking old values, old human rights principles, free speech, free assembly, free association, and giving them and amplifying them. So now it's not a matter of, you know, doing samizdat, doing, you know, pieces of paper that you hand out in a square. It's opening up to everybody in your society, in fact, everybody in the world. It empowers people. It allows them to do what they've always wanted to do with governments less able to control it. The flip side is that governments are so nervous about this that they've begun to crack down. And so there's sort of a cat and mouse game going on, and we're trying to stay one step ahead of the cat.
Yeah. You know, there's this sort of debate that goes on, which is a little bit frustrating and a little bit simplified, but between the sort of cyber utopians on the one hand who think everything has changed and, you know, the power of this technology is such that repressive regimes over some medium term don't stand a chance. And on the other hand, cyber skeptics who think, wait a minute, a lot of these tools are proving much more effective in the hands of authoritarian regimes than they are in the hands of opposition leaders. And then there are some people in the middle. Where are you in that spectrum?
I'd call myself a cyber optimist. I don't think it's the answer to everything, but I think it's so much part of the solution. And what the challenges we faced with governments, you know, misusing the technology and you know, imposing censorship and breaking people's right to privacy, I think we just have to figure out how to overcome those things. The reality is the world is very different today because of this ability to communicate, and we need to take advantage of it. It will be to our interest in the long run.
Yeah. How in particular do you think we can help opposition figures, and not just opposition figures, people who want honest information, get around firewalls, and particularly in China? I mean, in China, my sense is that it's not that hard for people who have some technological sophistication to use a proxy server and get around a firewall. But most people don't, either because they're afraid or because it's a hassle or because their opinions actually conform more or less to what they've been given through official sources.
Yeah, you know, I was in China in April. I've been there 3 or 4 times since I'm in this job, and one of the things that's very striking to me is there are a number of Chinese citizens. I wouldn't even call them all activists, but people who have concerns about labor issues, about tainted milk, about the environment. And what they want increasingly is the ability to speak to one another and to get information that exists within that society. We've spent a lot of time trying to think about how to break through a firewall to present our information to them. In fact, they're Chinese that want to know what's happening in the neighboring city, the neighboring village, and they are very resourceful in trying to figure out how to overcome the technical obstacles. I think increasingly the Chinese government and others that put resources to try to stop that are fighting a losing battle. People are demanding information, and they're creative in going and getting it.
Do you think a big shift is going to require some technological breakthrough, like a freedom box that people in this country will have to help Chinese opposition figures, or do you think it's sort of all in place already?
No, I think our role is to keep pushing for an open internet that crosses borders, that's a neutral platform that allows people to use these technologies for whatever purpose, if it's commercial, if it's for educators, for innovators, or it's for activists. I think our job is to protect the space that's been created so wonderfully and prevent governments from trying and others from trying to restrict it in ways that will make that less effective.
Now, when you talk about restriction and censorship on the internet, someone does have to censor the internet. I mean, when you think about it, you and I would agree that there are certain things that should not be allowed, whether it's child pornography or information about manufacture of nuclear weapons. Right. There's some minimum number of things, and we would try to keep them small, that we would agree should be censored. But who should censor them? Right now we have a kind of patchwork of technology companies, ISPs, governments. You know, how do you distinguish the kinds of censorship that's legitimate from the kind that's not, and who should be in charge of it?
You know, we have, before the internet was invented, we've had discussions for years in this country and every country about what are the legitimate controls on speech. And so this is really just the next generation of that. I think we need to find rules of the road, again, that are rooted in what you described. There are clear categories of things like pornography for children, or like, you know, implements of terrorism and violence that we want to control. Every government tries to do that. But here it's interesting, you have to deal with the range of governments, but also the private sector and the activists and the world of consumers. So finding the way to incorporate all of their interests and at the same time come up with these rules of the road is one of the challenges we face going forward. It won't be easy, but we're going to figure out how to do it.
Is it a national issue? Is it a supranational issue? I mean, who, you know, what's the body that's going to do that?
I think it's going to be certainly it's a national issue for us in every country, but there has to be some international discussion of that. I can't tell you right now that there's an obvious body to do that, and I think we need to be mindful of the multi-stakeholder, the multiple interests here. It's not just a matter of a dozen governments sitting in a room in Geneva and figuring it out. It's a much more lively discussion, and it should be.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you, Michael, about the big technology companies themselves and their role. Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo are frequently drawn into these issues around China, around Russia, around their cooperation with regimes or not, about whether they cooperate in censorship. What sort of attitude do you expect or would you like to see from these companies? Should they simply be, as Facebook has portrayed itself, kind of a neutral provider of a service that anybody can use? Or, you know, do you see them having a kind of social and human rights responsibility in terms of trying to be helpful to people who are on the right side of these issues?
Well, one of the things that Rebecca and I and others in this room, I'm sure, have worked on is trying to, and this is before I got into government, trying to create some standards or some principles on both internet freedom and privacy for the private sector. There's an organization, a private organization called the Global Network Initiative. And much to their credit, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft have all participated in that. And I think one of the things that now coming into government I'm very aware of is that we need the private sector to step up. We need them to work with one another to try to find some common guidelines and to really be a partner with governments like ours to try to figure out strategies for challenging both restrictions on free expression and also on privacy.
But you see them having an active role in challenging restrictions.
Yeah, there's a limit to what they can do in a given circumstance, but we need to figure out what are the best practices, what can companies do individually and collectively to push back against governments that are up to no good.
So Facebook approved in China will not be a happy headline from your perspective.
Well, you know, we're not telling any company what to do in a particular country. What we are encouraging is that the companies come together, establish guidelines, live by those guidelines, and then work with us.
Mike, I want to thank you for those comments, and we keep the trains running on time here at Future Tense, and I want to now hand things over to Andreas Martinez. Thank you.